welcome to the second part of our Module 5 lecture, where we'll be covering semantics. Our objectives for this module are listed here. Please take a moment to go over them, and they're also printed on our module page. Alright, so semantics allows us to ask the question, what's the meaning of all this? Well, more specifically, what's the meaning of a given word or phrase? Semantics refers to the study of meaning in language, and it allows us to ask questions about, for example, what does a word represent in the world? To what does a word refer to or denote in the world? And we're also able to ask questions about associated meanings or connotations of a given word. We took a look at these sentences at the beginning of the first part of our lecture, so let's take another look. We argued that the sentences shown here are perfectly acceptable in terms of the grammar or syntax of our language, but we also noted that there's something else wrong with them, namely that they don't make any sense. So semantics allows us to draw on a set of tools and descriptors that permit us to describe exactly why these sentences don't make sense. The study of semantics largely draws on this function of lexical decomposition. That is, that we can take a given word and we can break it down or decompose it into a number of features and also what we're going to describe later as semantic roles. So that is, what are the components of the meaning of a word, and also what is the role that that word plays within the larger meaning of a sentence. And this is a closely related concept to that of productivity or discreteness in language, where we're able to break down semantics and word meaning into a finite set of features or roles in order to characterize an infinitely large set of words with an infinitely varied set of meanings. When we encounter the sentence, "the hamburger ate the boy," we're likely to laugh and say, well, that's nonsense, but let's try to explain exactly why. If you were to explain this to a friend or a family member, you would likely say, well, that sentence is no good because hamburgers can't eat anything. Hamburgers are the things that get eaten. In terms of semantic lingo, the way we would describe that is that the subject of this verb, to eat, has to be an animate subject. It has to have this semantic property or feature of something that is alive. So animacy is just one of many possible semantic features that any type of lexical item can have or not have. Hamburger happens to not have the property of animacy, and that's part of what's wrong with this sentence. The terminology that we use to describe this need for a verb like to eat to take an animate subject is that that verb has a selectional restriction. The verb to eat selects for arguments of that verb which have the property of animacy. If they don't have that property, then we encounter a semantic violation, and that semantic violation results in a sentence which, while it's syntactically or grammatically acceptable, it semantically makes no sense. A selectional restriction, as just stated, refers to the fact that a verb selects for only certain kinds of subjects. When we say certain kinds here, we mean subjects that have certain semantic features. Semantic feature analysis is a process where we can describe the meaning of a word, the semantics of a word, in terms of the categories that it does or doesn't belong to. And we generally do this by using positive or negative markers. So you can be plus animate or minus animate. We here listening to this lecture are all plus animate. And this is the type of information that's represented in our mental lexicon. So for every word that we know, we have a whole host of associated semantic properties or features, and this is part of what constitutes our understanding, our meaning of that word in our mental lexicon. Let's take a look at our other sentence that we decided is no good semantically, although we've shown that it's perfectly fine syntactically. And let's try to pick apart what's going on in terms of semantic feature violations here. In the sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, well, there's actually a number of semantic feature violations here, but let's just take one. We have the noun idea, and that's an abstract noun. So abstract is the opposite of the property of being concrete. So we would mark that as being minus concrete in terms of the semantic feature of concreteness. Whereas, to contrast, a noun like leaf, which is a real object in the world, has the property of being plus concrete. So color adjectives like green, blue, red have the selectional restriction where they can only modify concrete nouns. So if we said green leaves sleep, well, that's a little bit better, but then what we're seeing is that there's something going on with sleep, right? Which is basically the same animacy selectional restriction that we saw in the past. We wouldn't just say that things that aren't alive sleep, typically. Beyond semantic features, we have this other phenomenon that we can use to describe words in terms of their meaning, and those are semantic roles. And this is sort of moving up a level, so rather than looking at a single lexical item and the features of meaning that that single item has, we can look at a larger sentence and characterize how different lexical items relate to one another. When we do this in terms of a verb and the arguments of that verb, namely the subject and predicate, we refer to this as the argument structure of that verb, and we can also call this, as it's called in the Shapiro tutorial, thematic roles. Let's take a look at a simple sentence, the boy kissed the girl, and attempt to answer what semantic roles are played by the arguments of that verb, to kiss. What we see is that the first noun phrase, the boy, is doing the kissing. And this would put him in the semantic role of the agent. He's the doer. And the girl, who's the recipient of the action, or the affected object of this verb to kiss, is the theme of the verb to kiss. And that's also referred to in some literature as the patient. Here's a detailed look at a number of semantic roles. Many of these are described in your textbook, although there are a few that may be new in this list. Just to give you a sense of the variety of semantic roles, but also to note that we don't have a limitless number here, right? So we're able to characterize lots in terms of a small set of possible semantic or thematic roles. The process of a verb assigning semantic roles to its arguments within a sentence is referred to as theta role assignment. So that means that a verb, which is a specific kind of lexical category, has the function of assigning its thematic roles to the arguments of that verb. So this is the verb's work. Let's take a look at a verb like sneezed. Now, what we've noted is that verbs can be quite varied. Some verbs we've described as intransitive, and they require only a single subject. Being an intransitive verb, it requires only one semantic role or argument in the subject position. And so the verb sneezed assigns the thematic role of experiencer to the subject NP, the girl. And then we have a nice sentence and we have our semantic roles all sorted out. The verb defeated is an example of a transitive verb. Being a transitive verb, it requires two arguments, that is, an agent and a theme. It needs someone to do the defeating and someone to be the recipient of being defeated. So in a sentence like, the girl defeated the boy, we see that the verb defeated assigns the theta role of agent to the girl, and now we can click off our requirement to have an agent, and the semantic role of theme or patient to the following NP, the boy. So now we have both theta roles assigned and we have a nice clean sentence. Verbs such as give or donate are examples of what are called ditransitive verbs, and these are verbs that require three arguments. So when we encounter a verb like gave within a sentence such as the coach gave the prize to the boy, we need gave to assign first the semantic role of agent, then the semantic role of theme, and finally the semantic role of goal. And if we were missing any one of these arguments, it would yield the sentence nonsensical. We wouldn't have a well-formed sentence because we wouldn't have all the arguments of the verb that we need. Interestingly, what we would note is that the ill-formedness of that sentence is something that's happening at the intersection of both semantics and syntax. So we can see how the structural requirements of the verb are not met if we don't have all three arguments. And furthermore, the sentence doesn't make any sense because the semantics of a verb, a ditransitive verb like gave, require, in order to be meaningful, to have all these roles fulfilled. Now let's move into lexical relations. This is how we describe the meaning of words in terms of how they're related to other words. And this is typically what we're doing anytime we try to explain or give a definition of a word just in casual conversation. But there's a number of types of lexical relations that we're going to describe here. So some lexical relations that you're likely already familiar with, but perhaps didn't realize fall into this linguistic area of semantics, are synonyms. So if I asked you, if you encountered someone who didn't know what a TV show was, you might say, well, it's a series or a program. And that's just an example of providing synonyms. You also might provide the opposite of what that word means, and that's an example of an antonym. And there's three different flavors of antonyms. Gradable antonyms are those that we can use in comparative constructions. So one example of an antonym would be young versus old, but we can also describe something in comparative terms. So we can say older than Jim or younger than Nancy. So that's a gradable antonym. And there are other types of antonyms that are non-gradable. So these are sort of binary descriptors. One example would be alive or dead. You can't be more alive or more dead than anything else. And then a special category of antonyms are reversives. So these are ones where the word pairs mean the exact opposite of one another. So to untie means the opposite of to tie. Another type of lexical relation is that of hyponyms. And these are words where basically the meaning of one word is included or contained in the meaning of another. So this is sort of moving down in a hierarchy and getting increasingly specific. The next three types of lexical relations are homophones, which are examples of words that have the same phonological form but the meaning changes. So the only difference between homophones and homonyms is that homophones have the same phonological form, but their orthography, the letters that we use to spell them, differ. And for homonyms, both the written form and the spoken form are the same. Polysemy is an interesting type of lexical relation, and this refers to one where the senses or meaning of a word are different, but they're very related. So, for example, in the case of homonyms, we have the case of a riverbank or a bank where you store money, and those meanings are not readily related in any obvious way. Whereas polysemous words are those that they have different meanings, distinct meanings, but they all seem to have a sort of unifying property. So when we use the term head, foot, or mouth, for example, those often refer to the same kind of thing, but in different scenarios. Okay, the last few lexical relations we'll discuss are the basis of a lot of humor and jokes and puns in our language. These are the sort of jokes that you would encounter on a popsicle stick, which are sort of corny jokes that take advantage of the multiple senses of meaning that we have for a given word. And because we have such rich representations of the semantics of our word, it's really what underlies our ability to make these kind of jokes and to find them funny. If you didn't have both senses of a word, it would be very hard to understand the punchline of a number of jokes, or to be able to derive the meaning of metaphors in literature. So this is actually a really a powerful and really not just amusing, but an intriguing aspect of language, and it's also a really lively area of study. So if, for example, you type into Google Scholar the terms humor and linguistics, this is just an example of some of the results that you might find. But people are really lively and really interested in understanding what is it about wordplay and what are the mechanisms of using plays on words to form jokes. Similarly, for metaphor, this is something that people researchers in linguistics comb through lots of existing texts and also use experimental paradigms to understand how listeners build up the meaning and sense around metaphor in language. Finally, we have the lexical relation of collocation, and I think this is actually a nice way of getting at the premise of descriptive linguistics. So this is sort of atheoretical. We don't have to come in and say, well, I think that these words are related, so I think they would probably occur close together, or people would use one and then likely use another. This is actually a case where we just say, what words do people tend to use with one another? And a common research approach to this is to take a huge volume of data, for example, newspapers or transcripts of television shows, and just note, using big data analysis methods, which words tend to occur together, close together. And that's called collocation. And to finish with a metaphor, I hope you've enjoyed dipping your toe into the world of semantics.